Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today we are joined by Paul Pietroski. Paul Pietroski is Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science at Rutgers University. He's the author of several books, including Causing Actions, Events and Semantic Architecture, and most recently, Conjoining Meanings, Semantics Without Truth Value. Today we will talk about internalist semantics, meaning, and innate ideas. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Pietroski, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thanks, very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So today I would like to focus on topics such as semantics, meaning, but also innate ideas and a bunch of other topics, I guess. Mm-hmm. So to kind of start off, could you maybe tell us a bit about your background? How did you get interested into philosophy and also cognitive science? And then maybe when did kind of Noam Chomsky enter into the picture of kind of the people that were putting out some interesting work?
Yeah. I was an undergraduate at Rutgers, where I've been teaching for the last 3 years. And I just started adding some philosophy courses to a major in history, largely because of this great course in philosophy of law that was taught by my now colleague, Doug Hussack. And then I started taking courses in epistemology and cognitive science with Peter Klein and Bob Matthews. They were very influential. But I have to say, in retrospect, my path to graduate school was pretty random and not especially thought out. I just got lucky that some of the Rutgers faculty nudged me in good directions. But I got into the philosophy program at MIT, and in the first week, the graduate director, who was George Boulos, he told me I was just going to take this course that was called Introduction to Linguistics for Non-Linguists. I knew nothing about the subject. And so I thought, sure, I'll take the course. And it turned out the first 3 weeks were taught by Noam Chomsky. So Chomsky was actually my intro to linguistics teacher. And he really did start at the beginning. And I was just, blown away and knocked out by the project. And during that same period, I was learning a little bit about Frege's logic from some lectures by George Boulos. Then I ended up working in other areas for some years while I was trying to learn some linguistics on the side. But those first experiences in graduate school were really very formative. And then, after I'd been an assistant professor at McGill in Montreal for a while, I got my first sabbatical. And I had a chance to go to the University of Maryland just when Chomsky's minimalist program was emerging. And so I spent some time there taking courses. And teaching a course with my now friend Norbert Hornstein. One thing led to another, and I ended up teaching linguistics and philosophy at Maryland. So I taught the Semantics course there for about 20 years and started doing collaborative work with Norbert and Juan Urigareca. And then, one thing leads to another. I was getting involved in psycholinguistics projects, first with Stephen Crane and Jeff Lids. And then by that point, I felt like, I was doing cognitive science and my work in philosophy was kind of catching up with the empirical work. I was sort of like finding my way home, I think, at that point, making connections between logic and linguistics. But, in retrospect, I can make some sort of sense of it. But at the time, it all just seemed, pretty random and haphazard.
That's very interesting. So, kind of to start off, so many people know that Chomsky has been quite skeptical of certain traditional approaches to semantics. So, before kind of trying to understand what is Chomsky's approach to semantics, so kind of his internalist approach, could you maybe summarize what are kind of Chomsky's worries with those more traditional programs in semantics?
Yeah. Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that for people currently working in semantics, traditional means something like since 1967, when Davidson writes his paper Truth and Meaning, and then after that, work by David Lewis, Richard Montague, Barbara Partee, and others. But there is a much older tradition of thinking about linguistic meaning. I mean, Chomsky himself had been talking about it since at least the last chapter of Syntactic Structures in 1957. And in my own view, there's a very relevant tradition of natural logic that goes all the way back to Aristotle via the medieval logicians, and in some respects, even back to Panini's Grammar of Sanskrit. But I know what you mean when people talk about traditional semantics, it's that kind of, David Lewis, Montague-inspired program from the late 1960s, early 70s. And one way or another, the fundamental idea is that notions like truth and reference, or maybe truth in a model, are going to be central to characterizing the notion of meaning as we find it in natural language. And it's now, I think, a little hard to remember that, in 1967, that was a radical idea, right? Davidson described it as a very bold conjecture. At least on my reading of the history, prior to 1967, if anybody had entertained the idea, they would have rejected it. So I think Frege, Wittgenstein, Strawson, Austin, Jerry Fodor, not to mention everybody before them, I think they would have just thought that the idea was just not on its face very plausible, and for pretty obvious reasons that, Wittgenstein highlighted in his own quirky way, but they were old observations, namely that ordinary words have very many uses, and there's no reason a priori to think that the real meaning of a typical word, say like book or window or line, is going to determine some real world correlate that's the word's denotation or semantic value or whatever. I mean, that's the new idea, that words really do have that kind of nice, clean semantics about them. But prima facie, from a logical point of view, words are equivocal. We can use the word window to talk about either the space that's created and that somebody could crawl through, or the pane of glass that fills that space. Or you can talk about, a window in a bank, or the window that's at the front of the store, that display space where stuff is kept. Chomsky uses examples like book and house to point out that there's the thing you can bump into in space, and then something like some kind of container, either for a content in the case of books, or a place to live in the case of a house. And if you ask yourself, right, what's the real world correlate of these things? It seems very odd, at least to me, to say, oh, well, window just stands for windows and book just stands for books. And it's just that some of them are abstract and some of them you can pick up and drop. Those kind of observations, that what seems to be a single word can get pushed around in various ways in different contexts and have very many uses. I think this was like pretty standard view in philosophy in the 50s and early 60s. And the fact that we can use, say, words like window, like in the way we do, I find fascinating. It reflects the kinds of minds we have. And as Chomsky stresses, there's just tons to be done there in terms of thinking about what that phenomenon is and how to characterize it adequately. From my perspective, currently, standard approaches to semantics either ignore it entirely, or they basically idealize away from it for purposes of providing some like rough initial sketch of how meanings might combine for what you might call, ideal thinkers who don't use words equivocally. And, there's nothing wrong with idealizations, but I think Chomsky's point, or at least the one I've taken away from his writings on this topic, is that once you get beyond that very severe idealization, you probably have to drop the idea that for each word there is some single semantic correlate of it, and that Davidson's bold conjecture was just false, as indeed most bold initial conjectures are.
That's very interesting. And when we maybe contrast that with one other person that's also mentioned also in the case of semantics, namely Hilary Putnam's claim. So Putnam famously says, cut the pie any way you like it, meanings just ain't in the head. And I think this is also something towards Chomsky, this claim. So can you maybe provide some context of Putnam's claim, and then maybe it might be good to also transition into kind of understanding what's the alternative, what kind of, how does Chomsky program look like? What does it look like?
Yeah, so there's a strand of what I think Putnam really cared about that I certainly want to endorse, and that I think Chomsky can endorse too. Putnam's larger interest was actually in how scientists can communicate over time despite changing theories, right? How is it that scientists manage to be talking about the same stars, despite the fact that over the centuries, people have had such wildly different views about what stars are. And that kind of question, got highlighted by Tom Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And many people, I think, didn't like the conclusions or diagnoses Kuhn wanted to make. And Putnam offered what I think is a really interesting idea and a kind of partial answer, namely that when scientists are using words like star, they're trying to use the words as something like what now gets called a kind term, and they're trying to use the word in this special way that tracks whatever the interesting phenomena is out there, independent of our theories and other conceptions of it. There's something, in my view, deeply right about that. In Putnam's famous paper, The Meaning of Meaning, Putnam, I think, took that larger interest and kind of applied it to natural language in a way that, in my view, is not especially helpful. When you read that paper carefully, you realize he starts with the idealization that meanings determine extension. So the thing I mentioned before, the kind of severe idealization that semanticists operate with, Putnam just basically adopts that and adopts it for the meanings of words like water. And so he effectively assumes that a word like water corresponds univocally to some extension that's determined by a natural kind. So it's not as though, in some sense, there's any argument for that. He just assumes it at the outset. And then he focuses on the use of water that really interests him. So he's basically setting aside the possibility that competent speakers of English can use water equivocally in the various ways Chomsky talks about, and he focuses on the uses that interest him. I mean, that's fine. But then when you get to later parts of the paper, or the middle parts of the paper, rather, it's almost as if he's then assuming those are the only uses, and then he starts drawing general conclusions, namely the extension of water has to be the extension fixed by this kind of kind term use. Now, I think of it sort of like starting on Monday in a chemistry class with the idealization that gas molecules are point masses. It's a very useful idealization. You suppose they don't occupy space and take up charge. But then it's as if, Putnam does the analog of continuing on Wednesday by confusing the idealization for a fact and saying, oh my God, gaseous molecules are these very weird things. They don't occupy any space and they don't have any charge. And so, my own perspective on this is that it would have been much better if Putnam had just, front and center put what he really cared about, discussion across generations between scientists have different theories, and not muddy that idea and what he wanted to say about it together with the idea that, in effect, words are equivocal, and that if you sometimes use a word like water to get at a kind, then that, by God, must be the only thing you do with it. And I think Chomsky rightly just wanted nothing to do with that.
That's very helpful. And just to clarify, so Chomsky wouldn't kind of have a problem with saying, okay, we want to indeed have reference kind of relations when we talk about science where this refers to that, and we want to kind of create a technical notion that provides kind of the right conditions for that to be true within scientific theory, that notion is kind of what he would accept from a kind of a story that Putnam is saying. Is that correct, or am I kind of
I always hesitate to don't want to speak for Chomsky, but I think that's right. I think there's a certain ideal we have for scientific language, that the expressions in such a language aren't going to be equivocal the way ordinary words are, and that talk of a reference relation gets at a certain kind of ideal we have for such a language. Tarski makes it explicit via his technical notion of satisfaction when he's talking about the first order predicate calculus. If you go back to the preface of Frege's Begriffsschrift and his various remarks that Frege makes throughout the course of his career, what he's trying to do, I think that ideal is there for him too. But I think it's always been an important strand of Chomsky's work to use ideal invented languages as certain kinds of models for framing questions, but then to immediately recognize, oh, of course, the natural object that we're interested in, the languages that human children acquire, they differ from these ideal models in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. Maybe before we really dig deeper into kind of this internalist semantics approach, we can contrast or understand how Chomsky has been influenced in his kind of views on semantics. So I think somewhere in your articles, you also mention the influence by Austin and Wittgenstein on Chomsky. So can you maybe elaborate on that? How did they maybe influence Chomsky's views on semantics?
Yeah. So I think the connection to the later Wittgenstein philosophical investigations on certainty, those works, there I think the connection is pretty straightforward. It's just stressing that ordinary words of a language that a child can acquire, including in particular the quirky word no in English, they just got a variety of uses, and we shouldn't expect cognitive scientists to come along and give us a theory of these words that have uses by insisting that the words are really just somehow correlates of external things that we would independently want to talk about. So, I think basically Chomsky took philosophical investigations more or less as read. And again, I don't think in one sense there was anything terribly radical about that. It's just that Wittgenstein and the Tractatus had flirted with a different view and then thought, no, we got to get back to the idea that expressions have many uses. And I think in the 1950s, there wouldn't have been anything especially controversial about that. Austin is, to my mind, a little bit more interesting, and it's easier to miss the connection, because one of the things Austin stressed is that even if you have an expression you would want to call sentential in natural language, that expression could be used to perform various kinds of speech acts, but in many cases, there'd be kind of a default speech act. So, right, to take a kind of classic example, a general tells a private, you will go to Europe. It's a declarative sentence used to make an assertion, but everybody knows that in that kind of context, it's kind of an indirect way of issuing an order. Whereas if the same sentence, you will go to Germany, is issued by a fortune teller, it's a different kind of speech act. So that idea that expressions in natural language have a certain grammatical character that invites a kind of use, but there's no tight connection that forces that kind of use. That kind of idea about how grammar is related to the rest of human cognition, I think you find that idea playing out in Chomsky's discussion of semantics at the end of syntactic structures, in some of his work in the early 60s, and in particular in a collection of essays that came out in the mid-70s called Essays on Form and Interpretation. This idea that, at least for minds like us, there's a kind of suggestiveness to how certain grammatical constructions or syntactic construction might get used, and yet there's nothing rock solid about it. It's not like the generalizations, let's say, of syntactic theory or phonological theory conceived of as a branch of grammar. You don't find categorical distinctions. You find in this area kind of, if you're a mind like us, you're going to find yourself wanting to use these noun phrases and verb phrases in this kind of way, but it's not as though it's absolutely mandatory. I mean, that sets up just really interesting questions about what's the nature of grammar, what's the nature of cognition grammar interfaces with, and how does the nature of that interface go?
Very
I think Austin was on to that early on.
That's very interesting. In one of your articles in the Chomsky Companion called Semantic Internalism, you also look at ambiguity as a guide to meaning, you mentioned. And in particular, you mentioned structural ambiguity, while also you recognize that there is, of course, lexical ambiguity. Can you maybe explain these different kind of forms of ambiguity, and how can we make use of those forms of ambiguity, and what can we kind of learn from them?
Yeah, good. So I think everybody's familiar with standard cases of lexical ambiguity, or sometimes called lexical homophony. So we have this noise bank that can in English be used to talk about stuff at the edge of rivers, or certain buildings where you can walk into and perform financial transactions. Philosophers sometimes call it a single word with two uses, but I think it's, much more plausible to just say what you have here are two distinct lexical items, two distinct words that happen to share pronunciation. Very common phenomena in the languages that kids acquire. A little thought makes it pretty obvious. There's also this phenomena called structural ambiguity or structural homophony, where you have a single string of lexical items, but there's two ways of putting them together to get two different, though related, meanings out. So a standard example might be a boy saw a man with a telescope. That can be heard in one way as saying a boy saw a man who had a telescope, so with a telescope is modifying man, or it can be heard in a second way as a boy saw a man by using a telescope, and so with a telescope is some kind of adverbial style modifier of the verb phrase saw a man. Chomsky started noting this phenomena for particular theoretical reasons in syntactic structures, and then in much more detail in a paper in 1964, and that plays a big role in his discussion in Aspects and thereafter. And part of the reason this phenomenon, I think, is of such interest is it gives us a kind of independent, you can go gather the data by polling speakers and seeing how kids understand these things. It gives us an entry into what we have in mind by the notion of meaning for purposes of providing theories of grammar, right? I mean, the word meaning is a paradigm of a word that has very, very, very many uses. So if we're going to use this word in cognitive sciences, we got to have some way of pinning down, if not exactly what Putnam would have thought of as a natural kind, something in that vicinity, that we're trying to get at some natural phenomena and not everything anybody might have meant by the word meaning. And so I take it that one of the things Chomsky suggested, and I found enormously useful suggestion, is that if you start with the just simple observation that lexical items are ambiguous, and then ascend to the, not very hard to make, but takes a little thought to recognize observation that you can have this phenomenon of structural homophony, then you can start noticing absences of structural homophony. So one of Chomsky's famous examples from the 60s was that John is eager to please isn't ambiguous, right? It means that John is eager that we or whoever please him. Doesn't mean that John is eager to he please us, though John might well be eager to please us. Flips example, John is easy to please, means it's easy for us to please him, not that it's easy for him to please us. And so if you can get yourself into the position of being struck and surprised by the fact that some strings of words are structurally ambiguous and some are not, then you've got a whole host of potential facts to be explained and that help us sharpen a notion of meaning. So we say that's what we're trying to get at by the notion of meaning when we're talking about grammar. We're recognizing that grammars pair pronunciations with meanings in really interesting ways. And even when you abstract away from lexical ambiguity, there's still a different kind of ambiguity left. And it's a kind that's interestingly constrained. And then you do psycholinguistic experiments and you find out that a lot of what adults know about the constraints on ambiguity are already known by a child at the earliest stages at which they can understand the words at all. And that then becomes a fascinating thing that you can get into. And again, if that's not exactly the kind of thing Putnam had in mind by a natural kind, it seems to me it's in that ballpark. And so that maybe we can begin to use the word meaning as a kind of technical scientific term, if only we have some paradigms to work on initially. And I think Chomsky just gave us some absolutely lovely paradigms to work on in the 50s and early 60s.
That's very fascinating. And you also go on to make an important distinction, and I think you already used this word a few times now, and sorry if I mispronounce it, but homophony and polysemy. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
No, it gets pronounced different ways in the profession. Some people I've heard call it polysemy. I call it polysemy. But since I'm an individualist about languages and don't think these are public objects, everybody can have their own pronunciation.
Yeah, definitely. So you make this important distinction, and also maybe just to connect it to Putnam again, you also kind of use this distinction and then explain some relevant relations to Putnam's twin Earth example. So maybe this is quite a lot, but maybe could you introduce this distinction? Can you introduce Putnam's thought experiment, and then how this distinction has some a way of kind of understanding that thought experiment?
Yeah. Okay. So let me think a second. This is going to connect up various things that have already come up.
Yes.
So homophony, I think for a working linguist, is just a name for this phenomena that genuinely distinct expressions can share their pronunciation. So again, that bank and bank are genuinely distinct words that just happen to have the same pronunciation. Just like you might think that lawyer and attorney are distinct words, they're pronounced differently, but maybe have the same meaning. So you might think there are just lots of cases of homophony, distinct meanings, so distinct expressions, but same pronunciation. The parade cases of polysemy are supposed to be cases that get you to think you can have a single expression that is a single lexical meaning, but it gets used in different but related ways. So sometimes people point out that when lexicographers are writing a dictionary, you'll get the distinctions between definition 1, definition 2, whatever. But then under 2, you might have 2A, 2B, 2C, which is the lexicographer's way of saying, I think this is a single definition, a single word meaning, but boy, it's getting used in these interestingly different ways. Cases like window and door are often trotted out as paradigms of this. So it's surely not an accident that we can use window to talk about both the pane of glass that fills a space and the space that the pane of glass fills. It's not an accident that we use the noise book both to talk about the contents of the book and the book that's heavy and that you can drop. Words that have that kind of, it pushes one way towards something you might describe as a certain abstraction or a certain kind of functional utility, and pushes another way towards something you can bump into in space and time regardless of what its function happened to be. Those are often brought out as the starting paradigm cases for notions of polysemy. And in my view, those starting cases, we might think of as garden variety polysemy, are instances of a much, much larger phenomena, namely that, going back to what I was saying earlier in connection with the later Wittgenstein, that words are just, from a logician's point of view, kind of equivocal. You can use the same word to get at different ideas in different contexts. And not just in the way you can use words like I, here, and now to get at different speakers, places and times in different contexts. That's obvious. But, the contextual sensitivity, if you want to call it that, of words like window and line and democracy, and in my view, just about every word you might pull out of the dictionary, they seem to be importantly different than the kind of context sensitivity you get with words like I, here, now. And so, I think it's important to just recognize there's this general phenomenon of conceptual equivocality that words exhibit. I mean, not everybody likes putting it this way, but I tend to think of it as you've got a single word and you can express related but different concepts with the word on different occasions of use. If you go back to the poverty of stimulus par excellence, Plato's discussion in the Meno, although it's not Plato's intention, one of the things it brings out is, we use these words like triangle to sometimes describe things we can see, either drawn in the sand or on a blackboard, and sometimes to describe these abstract objects about which we can prove theorems. I think our concept of the thing we can see on the board is just different than the concept of that which we can prove theorems about. And this goes beyond anything Chomsky might want to say. So I should say here I'm expressing my own view. But if you take it that far and say the normal case is for words of a human language to be conceptually equivocal, Then the Putnam thought experiment looks like it's just begging the central question. So Putnam gives us a thought experiment in which people use water in a context where somebody keeps saying, science matters, science matters, science matters. Have I mentioned that chemical composition matters? And in such contexts, people can use water as a way of getting it some stuff that we now know how to describe as H2O plus or modulo some impurities. And then Putnam concludes from that the extension of water is H2O plus or minus impurities. But I take the point of Chomsky's examples when he points out that, if he's got a cup of pure H2O and dips a tea bag into it, now he's got a cup of tea whose H2O content might be higher than what comes out of many taps. I take that as a way of pointing to the idea that the word water can be used in this different way that I would want to describe as saying, expressing a different concept, one that's got a more functional basis. And if words are conceptually equivocal, that's no surprise, in which case we shouldn't find it surprising if Putnam is right about the context he's talking about, but there are also contexts where somebody says, hey, science doesn't matter. We're worrying about like whether you can get a drink from this stuff. And then when I think that way, I find it no problem as a speaker of English to use the word water to talk about the distinct stuff, Putnam's XYZ, that's on his imagined planet, and say the people on that planet are drinking water from their garden hoses, and maybe some bartenders are watering down the whiskey at their place. It seems to me it's perfectly fine to use water to get at this concept that isn't tied to H2O, but is rather tied to the human uses in a different sense that we typically have for the stuff water. And so I don't want to say that water is polysemous in the way linguists would normally describe polysemy, but I do think words like water are conceptually equivocal in this broader way that we initially see when we think about words like window and line and triangle and book.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. One follow-up question that I'm thinking about now, when you mentioned that Putnam was also kind of worried, kind of from a science perspective. Okay, are these theories successfully referring to, for example, water is H2O, whatever? But is it a problem that we find out that this reference term that we have used in, for example, a scientific theory turned out to be wrong? That then it wouldn't matter that it was referring in kind of a technical sense because it was wrong anyway. Like, is that not still a worry that comes up then, or am I?
No, it's a great question. A former student of mine, Chris Vogel, wrote his dissertation, is now starting to publish some papers on exactly this kind of question. To what degree, even internal to science, do we find a kind of conceptual equivocality? An obvious place to start, given the history in biology, is with words like species, and then think about moving out from there. I think I said earlier that we have as a kind of ideal that our theories would have terms that let us make sense of some kind of reference relation and getting away from this kind of conceptual equivocality. But as Frege noted, there's a tension between having expressions that fit that ideal and expressions that are usable in reasonable human communication. To the degree that at any given stage in science, we're on some days of the week trying to put a precise theory on the blackboard, and on other days of the week just trying to have a conversation and understand the phenomena, it would not surprise me if in actual scientific practice, there's still a reasonable amount of conceptual equivocality. Let's say with the most mathematicized versions of physics giving us the limiting case at the moment for having the least of it. But it's going to take really good philosophers of science who know lots of philosophy of language to sort that out. And that's not anything I'm going to have a strong opinion about, I think, in the time left to me.
Okay, interesting. Moving on a bit further into kind of this internalist semantics approach, you also talk about, I mean, Chomsky, of course, makes a distinction between I language versus E language, but in addition to that, you also introduce I meanings, or maybe Chomsky also introduced them somewhere, but I never saw him mention that term specifically, but I noticed that you mentioned it kind of as an extension or an addition to kind of this I language, E language distinction. And then also you raised the question, how do they indeed relate to human concepts? So can you maybe clarify this notion of I meanings and how that does I meanings set kind of the tone or kind of the direction of an internalist semantics approach?
Yeah. So let me just first say that for Chomsky and for me too, the I language, E language distinction is the one that's really important here. And it's important to understand the I in I language as being fundamentally a way of getting at the distinction between what's sometimes called functions in intension versus functions in extension, the distinction between a procedure that yields an output given an input and a set of input output pairs. Alonzo Church made that distinction front and center when he was introducing the lambda calculus for purposes of thinking about computability. And when Chomsky introduced the I language, E language distinction, I think that's Knowledge of Language from the 1980s, he's getting at the same idea that the fundamental distinction is between a procedure and an extension for a procedure. And it might be that the I also connotes and make us think about internal to the head and individualistic. But those are, at least from my point of view, things that come along for the ride after the fundamental procedure versus extension distinction. With that in mind, I think of I meanings as the meanings that certain procedures, the procedures that Chomsky calls grammars, pair with pronunciations. I happen to also think that these I meanings, the meanings that grammars pair with pronunciations, are usefully viewed as procedures themselves, procedures for building up mental representations. But that's a kind of further add-on to the central idea, which is that when we're studying human languages, I, following Chomsky, think what we're really studying are procedures of a kind that human kids find it natural to acquire. Those procedures pair meanings of a certain kind. What kind? Well, let's look at the phenomenon of ambiguity to get an initial start. These procedures pair those kinds of meanings with pronunciations, and now game on, let's figure out what the meanings are. As a matter of fact, I tend to think about the meanings as having a kind of procedural character to them, and I think about them as internal to the head. But those are not mandatory additions. Peter Ludlow, in his book on the philosophy of generative grammar, and in more recent work on the phenomenon of communication, right, is willing to follow Chomsky part of the way in drawing the I language, E language distinction, but thinks you can still be externalistic about the meaning. So in one sense, I think the most important thing here is to not just get too distracted by the terminology. Fundamental thing, distinguish procedures from their extensions. And then when you focus on the procedures, then let's ask what these meanings are. And then to answer the second part of your question, I do think the meanings are something like instructions for how to build up mental representations. And those instructions are encoded biologically. They're firmly in the head. So whereas Putnam would have said, cut the pie any way you like, meaning is in the head, I'd have said, cut the pie in a reasonable way that makes sense to a cognitive scientist and a linguist, and you're going to end up with meanings that are in the head.
I see. And one follow-up question I would like to ask is so when we take this procedure as kind of a fundamental or kind of the core, one distinction that I've been mentioning also to Norbert Hornstein, but also to Chomsky, is between content innateness and mechanism innateness.
Yeah.
Because I'm still fascinated by this, especially when we now again emphasize this kind of procedural component, which some people might link, it seems like intuitively, with more of the mechanism innateness. But I remember Chomsky mentioning basically that on his view, kind of those two distinctions collapse. So I'm just wondering, how would you think about these notions, kind of, and maybe also how that maps onto maybe internalist/externalist kind of approaches to semantics, how those different forms of innateness might map onto that differently.
Yeah. So I think once upon a time, I did think there was a pretty clear distinction between content innateness and mechanism innateness. And I guess I still think as a conceptual distinction, it's still reasonably clear. In the case of language, I confess that the older I get, the more I lose track of the distinction. And maybe that's just because we're not in a position yet to really make the distinction vivid. But when I think about content innateness as applied to language, I find myself just initially thinking about, okay, what were the principles of universal grammar that the child was supposed to come into the world with and use as their basis for acquiring whatever particular language or languages they happen to acquire. And when I thought about mechanism innateness, I was thinking like something, that's something like, even Quine and Locke could accept we come into the world with various kind of mechanisms for forming representations. They have whatever character they have. But, especially in light of what's happened since Chomsky's introduction of minimalist thinking into linguistics, and the more, I've come to realize there's, for Chomsky, no really deep distinction between syntax and semantics. And then one could even think of semantics as a kind of species of what he sometimes calls broad syntax. And given that now, even in linguistics, when you're talking about principles of universal grammar, I think increasingly few people are thinking about them as like, principles that get written down on some kind of Jerry Fodor blackboard in the head. And the child consults them to make sure they don't acquire grammar that violates those principles. Like, no, it's just got something to do with the kinds of minds we have. There's some kind of just constraint in our cognitive architecture. That means when a child grows up, they grow up acquiring a language that's like this and not like that. If that's the way to think about it, then I do find myself just losing track about what the real substantive distinction would be between content innateness for syntax semantics, holding phonology aside for the moment, and mechanism innateness. When people ask me about my own work and they say, well, Paul, there you are saying that the meaning of brown cow is an instruction to go get a concept from a certain mental address that's associated with the pronunciation brown, go get a concept from a mental address that's associated with the pronunciation cow, and then conjoin them in this way you talk about. Are you talking about an actual mechanism in the head that kids are implementing as they're hearing stuff? Or are you still just giving an abstract description of linguistic competence? And I feel that I'd better be giving an abstract description of linguistic competence because we don't yet have the tools to look inside and find out how that competence is deployed in real time. Though, like people like Lena Pilkanen at NYU are trying to give it a good go and make the connections. I'm in no position to say exactly how do the procedures I'm talking about get executed in real time any more than I think Chomsky thought in 1957 he was ready to go with a proposal about how a phrase structure grammar would get deployed by a child who was trying to understand sentences. I think in theoretical linguistics, we're still very much at the stage of trying to characterize competence in a way that we hope will be smoothly continuous, or at least not at odds with performance. But it's really hard, right? When Berwick and Weinberg started talking about this kind of stuff in the 80s and trying to say, how do you get a grammar to connect up with a parser? it was really hard, and it's still really hard. You know, my former colleague from Maryland, Colin Phillips, and his group, they're hard at trying to make these connections between competence and what used to be thought as performance in interesting ways. But, you know, I find those just issues very, very difficult. And when you're at the level of a theorist trying to write down a grammar, you know, are we talking about content or mechanism? I would hope the answer is yes, but I don't know really much more to say than yes.
No, that's very fascinating. Maybe moving on a little bit, but still on the topic of innateness. You also have a great article, or you're the co-author of this article called Innate Ideas. It's also of the Cambridge campaign, I think, of Chomsky Cambridge campaign of 2006, if I remember correctly. And here
right, it's a paper with Steve Crane.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot the other person. Yeah, great. And here you kind of say that Chomsky usually doesn't use this terminology of innate ideas himself. And also you think that the traditional terminology around innate ideas has been even misleading in some sense. So I have 3 questions related to this issue. Namely, could you maybe just elaborate a bit in the context, how should we understand innate ideas from kind of people like Descartes? And then also Chomsky does align himself with thinkers like Descartes in the sense of kind of rationalism, but also Cutworth, he often mentions, especially related to innate ideas and also in the moral sense, innate ideas. But then also he diverges from those people in all sorts of ways. So maybe to get this picture straight, how should we understand all those differences?
All right. So let me for the moment bracket Cudworth, right, which seems to me like a super interesting special case to discuss. We can come back to it. Like for the moment, bracket Cudworth, and say, look, when Stephen and I were writing that paper, like one of the things we just did was, okay, let's just scour Chomsky's corpus and find out how often he uses the phrase innate idea. It's not very often. And one of the classic passages, so often cited, but though it's really, people cite it as though you're going to find this everywhere in Chomsky's work, but it's not. But there is a place in aspects where it comes up kind of in passing. And likewise for the phrase universal grammar. It's not like a phrase that Chomsky uses again and again and again in all of his written work. And I think for philosophers, when they hear innate ideas, they immediately think Locke and maybe the Locke-Leibniz debate. And what I'm pretty sure of is that it's not that Chomsky thinks that there are innate ideas of the sort Locke was out to criticize. I think it's an open question whether any intelligent person thought there were innate ideas of the sort Locke was out to criticize. But in any case, I don't think Chomsky thought there were such things. And so, like, part of what I always want to do when the topic comes up is says, now look, if we're going to talk about innate ideas and Chomsky, let's recognize we're not talking about mental representations or ideas in Locke's sense that are somehow present from birth. Nor are we even talking about concepts of a Jerry Fodor sort that somehow just get triggered in your head as if the presentation of a carburetor makes you now very quickly upon conversation activate a concept of carburetor which is somehow latent there all along, right? I don't think that's the picture. When you talk about Descartes, now I think we're getting much closer to what Chomsky and I would want to endorse in the domain of language, that it's not as though there are ideas specific to specific languages that are innate. On the contrary, the things that are specific to specific languages are the things that the child must have acquired in the course of having experience interact with their innate capacities. There might well be fundamental notions of grammar in Chomsky's sense that are innate in the sense that they're representations, for lack of a better word, that the child uses to acquire any grammar at all. So one of the things I think has been so important in coming to grips with Chomsky's early work is the heavy stress he puts on the importance of getting the right theoretical vocabulary. And what we're really trying to do in characterize particular grammars is not so much just get that particular grammar right, A, because that's nightmarishly hard, and B, who really cares about getting one particular grammar right? What we want to do is get at the framework that allows the child to acquire the grammars they do. That may require, from the theorist's point of view, a very sophisticated vocabulary. Right? You got to get past notions like subject and object and get on to notions like noun phrase and verb phrase and government and binding. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of those notions will deserve to be called innate to the child in some sense when we sort all this out. Mm-hmm. But the important point is whether or not you want to say the child's coming into the world with particular representations, is that the child's coming into the world with a certain kind of capacity that, so far as we can tell, our primate cousins just do not have. That capacity then is such that under the course of normal experience, and now let's call them ideas, ideas grow within the child. Insofar as those ideas will grow in a human under conditions of normal experience, but they wouldn't grow under conditions of normal experience for a chimp, an orangutan, or a raven, or a blue jay. And moreover, insofar as these ideas that grow up in the child given normal experience have a certain kind of character to them that lets us characterize them as, oh, those are the linguistic ones, that they do seem to be in some sense autonomous from just general thinking. And the way the child uses them is not by simply applying something like a general empiricist learning strategy because they're trying to cope with the world, but rather these ideas are growing in the child under the pressure of normal experience and getting used in very particular ways that we call acquiring a human grammar. Well, I'm fine with using the word innate ideas to talk about that. And I'm fine with using universal grammar to talk about that. And I think, however, whatever language we want to use, that's the idea to get at. And then you realize, oh no, that goes considerably beyond what Locke or Quine or various empiricists had in mind. And it really gets at a really quite substantive notion of innateness that, Descartes and Leibniz, and I think in a different way, even, Plato was already operating with. And I think, Chomsky really wants to tap into that tradition. So whenever you see phrases like innate idea or universal grammar, either used in passing by Chomsky or used by others trying to understand his views, what I think it really is important is to kind of get loose of what are sometimes called the traditional associations of those, and then just focus. And Chomsky hasn't hid this, right? There's an entire book, Cartesian Linguistics, devoted to saying this is the historical tradition I'm drawing on when I talk about these ideas. And so if you, for example, try to then figure out where Chomsky and Quine diverged, right? You'll often hear it from philosophers, oh, there was no really big difference. Quine was quite happy to say the child's up to its neck in innate mechanisms, as if that addresses the kind of point that Chomsky was trying to address. And on my reading, it just doesn't.
Well, that's very fascinating and helpful. Maybe as a final question, I guess, you've been doing very exciting work also, in the semantics space and also from kind of a Chomsky framework. What are some kind of future kind of questions that you think is relevant questions that maybe haven't been answered sufficiently from kind of a Chomsky framework of semantics that are still open today, where you think, okay, this is really the tricky questions we're dealing with?
So going back to, one of your first questions about traditional semantics. Yeah. Studies of the quantifiers played a very important role in that early work, in particular, Lewis Montague and then Barbara Partee and others following them. And really the study of quantification has in many ways been at the heart of theorizing about semantics, at least since then, but I think was also at the heart for a project that wasn't called Semantics, again, going back to Aristotle and the medieval logicians. But it's kind of a background assumption in contemporary semantic theorizing that words like every and most and all and 13, they're actually a little unlike ordinary vocabulary, right? So, as I said before, contemporary semantics begins with, in my view, the odd, but okay, we can run with for a little while, idealization that lexical items are not nearly as conceptually equivocal as Chomsky or I or late Wittgenstein was suggesting. But there's a general thought that when it comes to words like every or most, there is a certain kind of conceptual equivocality that's allowed. Namely, what do we know about how individual speakers represent the extensions of these words? Every just goes with the subset relation. But there are many ways of representing the subset relation when you think of it. You can use a first order universal quantifier that might be restricted, it might be unrestricted. When you get to a word like most, everybody knows there's like a bunch of different ways to write down what the alleged extension of that term is. And there's kind of background thought that comes out when you talk to semanticists at conferences. But look, that's right. What we in semantics are trying to get at is the mind-independent extension of the word. Mm-hmm. And everybody's got however they represent it, and we're not interested in that. Mm. So together with Justin Halberta, a vision scientist at Johns Hopkins, Jeff Lids, a psycholinguist at the University of Maryland, and then some of our students, starting with Tim Hunter and Darko Odic, and then others, now including Tyler Knowlton. We just started to ask, well, is this true? Is it true that in fact, speakers of a language like English who have a quirky word like most, is it true that they really just represent the extension of that word in diverse ways? Or does grammar force upon them a particular computational format? Is the interface between grammar and the rest of the mind shaped on the one side by grammar and the other side the rest of the mind, leading to a kind of unique solution? Well, if you're going to have a word like most, this is the way you have it. Now, we think we got some initial evidence suggesting that that was right, but it was initial evidence. Other people are disagreeing and saying, no, this doesn't fit with our conception of semantics. But, in work that a graduate student, Tyler Knowlton, has been the lead on, trying to push this into thinking about the various universal quantifiers in natural language, words like each and every and all, how they differ, what the representational formats are. I think for me, for the next little while, that kind of work is going to play a kind of lead role in my theoretical thinking, because I think that if the empirical facts come in, that even with regard to quantifiers, it's representational format that matters. It's not what's going on out there in the world independent of how we think about it. It's what kind of representational formats do humans just project because of the kinds of beings we are. Yeah. If that's true even for quantifiers, then I think the holy of holies of traditional semantics is in trouble, because then I think it's going to be, it doesn't work very well for the open class lexical vocabulary items like window and line. And when you say, yes, but it's such a great idealization for the quantifiers, I suspect the answer is going to be yes, and an idealization that doesn't explain very much and doesn't get at the facts cognitive scientists should want to get at. So I feel like that's where my thinking is going to be for the next little while.
No, that sounds very exciting. So Professor Pietroski, thank you so much for this conversation. As always, I learned a lot from the experts, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I'm not sure if you have any parting words to the audience.
No, just thanks very much. This was a lot of fun, and I'm delighted you're doing this thing of making Chomsky's thought available to lots of people. It's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.